Okay, you hear all the time about the Fed dual mandate, right?
Yeah.
And this didn't make it into the book, but my sincere conclusion is that this idea of the dual mandate from Congress, which is a law that says the Fed needs to simultaneously control inflation of prices, control price inflation, and push us toward, quote, full employment, which is an ambiguous number. No one knows what it is, but it's like the best employment rate we can get to. That idea of the dual mandate is nonsense, okay? And the reason I say that is these two things are in tension. Sometimes to control price inflation, you need to do things that create more unemployment. And sometimes to boost employment, you need to raise inflation. And the Fed has shown time again, almost immediately, like after this so-called dual mandate was passed in the late 70s, the Fed president, Paul Volcker, hiked interest rates to tank inflation. But that raised unemployment, and Congress said, hey, you've got this dual mandate. He said, well, the dual mandate's a thing you got to measure over time. We're bringing down the unemployment rate over the long term by hiking interest rates. So like that mandate is a sliding scale and doesn't make sense. But there's an actual real dual mandate of why we created the Fed in 1913, and it was really important. The Central Bank of the United States, which is the Federal Reserve, was created to do two things. The first is to create and manage a national currency. That thing we call the US dollar is actually a Federal Reserve note. And this is important. Before the Fed, there were literally thousands of currencies in the United States. It was a wild, kind of unmanageable system. It created tons of economic volatility, banking panic after banking panic. We could walk through that, but it was an unworkable system. And the US had been kind of resistant to creating a central bank. But by 1913, we just decided we had to do it. And so we created the Fed to give birth to the Federal Reserve note dollar and to manage that currency. And then the second part of the mandate of what the Fed was supposed to do was to be the lender of last resort. So in case of a banking panic, the Fed was supposed to step in, print new money, create dollars, and lend it to otherwise healthy banks to stop panics. Because we all know when a bank panic happens, people go in and rush in to get their money, and they can kill otherwise healthy banks. So the Fed was put in the center of the banking system to stop that, to be the firefighter. And for many, many decades, the Fed did that job exceptionally well. Between 1913 and the 1990s, more or less, the Fed did a great job. I talk in the book about the inflation of the 1970s, which really was very largely the Federal Reserve's fault. And that comes from studies the Fed itself has done looking back. We can talk about that. But what happens in 08, 09 really is a breaking point or a major historical change in that in the shadow of the crisis of 08, 09, our democratic institutions that could stoke economic growth like Congress and the White House, these democratic institutions were really dysfunctional and paralyzed. It's not a coincidence that this book starts in November 2010 when the Tea Party sweeps into power in DC, and essentially all action in Congress shuts down. And as a nation, we kind of relied on the Fed to step in and create economic growth through printing money. And that's a very different thing from being the lender of last resort. That's saying we're going to be the first resort of growth at the Fed, and we're going to try to stoke growth through printing money. And the track record is just incredibly disappointing. What you see from a policy of hyper easy money is that it created huge upswings in asset markets, huge upswings in the price for stocks, for corporate leveraged loans, for commercial backed mortgages, commercial real estate mortgages, rather. These things explode. So you see breaking records in the stock market. But overall growth is weak. Productivity growth is weak. Wages stagnate. The middle class continues to spin its wheels and fall behind. And so we've really had a decade of hollow growth that the Fed contributed to mightily through these programs.